Hey there and welcome back. This is the second video of our series where you're going to learn how to build a website using Payload CMS and NextJS. Today we are going to learn how we can build dynamic pages and blocks, and we're also going to set up our project. To get started, I've created an empty repository and open up a terminal session. Now to set up our backend, the first thing that I'm going to do is say npx create payload app. This will ask me for the project name. First of all, I'm going to name it Payload NextJS tutorial backend. We're going to choose the blank template and we will go for a MongoDB database. Now I'm actually going to paste in a connection string that I've created already in MongoDB Atlas. And now it will install all dependencies. Now, after all dependencies have been installed, I'm first going to go into the project folder, and I'm going to delete two files to clean it up, the Docker file and the Docker Compose file. Also, I will change the server port to port 4000 because that's just how we do it. We have port 4000 for the backend and port 3000 for the front. Now in the payload config, I'm going to remove the payload cloud plugin since we are not going to use it in this tutorial. And then we can already boot up our development server by running npm run dev. Now, if we go over to our browser and go to localhost 4000, we will be prompted with our welcome screen where we need to create our first user, which I'm going to do right now. Okay, so now we're in our blank default admin panel. Let's continue by creating the two collections that we need. So first of all, since we want to create pages from our backend, what we will need to create is a pages collection. Also, since we want to have images or videos on our website, we also need to create an upload collection. We're going to call it media, where we can actually store our files that should be then delivered to our website. So I'm going to create our first collection here, which is called pages. And in this one, I'm going to export const pages. So if you create a collection, the first attribute that you need is a slug. We're going to call this slug pages. Also, we're going to add labels for singular, so one page and many pages. And then we're going to add fields. Now there are three important fields. First one is the name for the website so that you can find it in your system. We are going to make it required as well. The second one, which is even more important, is the slug. Okay, so the slug is basically what appears in your URL. So if you go to a website, payloadcms.com/cloud, for example, cloud will be the slug of the page, and every page needs a slug, obviously. And the third attribute will be, you can name it content. We are going to name it layout. So this layout will be the foundation for our dynamic block model. So the way this will work is you create pages and every page has an array of blocks within it. So one block could, for example, be the hero block, okay? And below the hero block will be a text block. And you can basically create blocks in your code, and then you can add those blocks to the pages and rearrange them how you want, and that's how you build a page in the end. So the layout will be type blocks, and it also needs an attribute called blocks, which will be an array, but we're going to leave this empty for now since we haven't really created any blocks yet. For the media collection, we're going to create a second file called media. And this is pretty much the same thing, export const media. You also need a slug, and you can choose labels, which will be just media. One important thing though that you have to watch out for, you need to set the upload to true, okay? You can also provide a configuration object here, but for simplicity, we're just going to set it to true. This will enable uploads for this collection. What this will mean, you're going to see that in just a few seconds. Regarding the fields, we actually don't really need any fields, but what would make sense is to have an alt field, which is the alternative text that is going to be shown if your image can't load, for example. Label alt type text. We can make it required. That probably makes sense due to SEO. One important thing that we have to add to both collections is access control, which means both collections should be public. Otherwise, people won't be able to retrieve any data if they're not logged into Payload. So what we're going to do is set the access attribute to read, and read will be a function that always returns true. And we're going to do the same thing for pages, obviously, because both of them should be public. Now what we need to do as well is add those two collections to our payload configs. So here we already have the users collection, and to that we're going to add the pages collection, and we're also going to add the media collection. Now, as you can see, since this is TypeScript and our collection configs are JavaScript, it's going to mark them in red. It's not really an issue, but we decided to use JavaScript for our tutorial just for simplicity. Now, if we restart our development server, it's going to take a couple of seconds. Those collections should appear in the admin panel. So if we go over to our browser and refresh the page, we can see we not only have a users collection, but also a pages and a media collection. And if we try to create a new page, we can put in a name, we can put in a slug, and we could add a layout, but we don't have any blocks specified yet. So let's create our blocks now. In this tutorial, we are going to create two very simple blocks just to explain the concept to you. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder in our source folder named blocks. And in this folder, I'm going to create two new files. The first block that we're going to create is the hero block. So I'm going to name it hero.js. Now it's pretty similar here. We also need to create a config, export const hero. And blocks, similar to collections, also need a slug. So I'm going to say slug hero, or you can call it hero block, whatever you want really. I'm going to add labels as well. So singular hero block, and plural will be hero blocks. Now for the fields, I'm actually going to paste them in because it's faster. We're going to have 3 fields. So our block should have a heading in the center. It should have a text, which is smaller than the heading below it, and it should have a background image. Okay, so those are the 3 fields. Heading and text are both just plain text, no matter if it's text or text area. Text area is basically just a way for Payload to know that it's not just one single line of text, but rather a text area. But it will still be stored as a plain string. Now for the background image, we're going to have a type upload. So this will actually create a small upload field. You're going to see it in a second, where you will be able to just drag and drop your media in and upload it to the system. And for that to work, we need to have a relationship to a collection which has uploads enabled. In this case, it's the media collection. So for our second block, we're going to create a 2-column block. 2column.js. Same thing here, export const to column. And we can use some auto completion. I like to do it camel case. Obviously you can do it however you want to do it. On the labels and for the fields, they will be pretty similar to our hero block. However, we have one additional field, which I'm going to show you here. Sorry, I pasted that twice. All right, so as you can see, we have a heading as well. We have a text below the heading and we have an image. So the way I imagine this to look like is you have an image on the left side and you have a heading on the text on the right side. However, I've added an additional attribute called direction, which is a select field and which lets us select either the default direction or a reverse direction. So this field will be used to control whether we have an image on the left side and text on the right side, or if we have a reversed order, okay? So image on the right side and text on the left side. You will see how this is implemented in the front end later. Now, after we have created those 2 blocks, we will have to add them to our pages layout. Okay, so I'm just going to import them here, hero and 2column. Now let's restart our development server and let's see if the blocks appear in our admin panel. So if we create a new page now, we click on add layout, we can actually see those 2 blocks pop up. So let's actually create our first new page, shall we? So let's call it test page. It will have the slug test. So whatever our domain is, it will be our domain / test. And then I'm going to add 2 blocks. First will be the hero block with a heading, this is a test hero, beautiful description text. And I'm also going to add a background image. Now I've already downloaded just a standard stock image and I'm going to drag and drop it. Sorry, I have to click on upload media first, but now I can actually drag and drop it into here. I can also rename it if I want. So just going to call it background image, tables in a room as an alt text, click on save, that will upload the image and now it's added as a background image. And I'm also going to add our second block, which will be second 2column block as a heading, short description text. And I'm going to use the same image. And I'm also going to use the default direction. Now if I click on save, as you can see, I've successfully created my first page. One thing that I just noticed after saving is that the layout didn't get saved. So the issue was that I just had to restart my server real quick and then also refresh the page once, and that will actually fix the issue. So let's refresh our page, wait until the server is restarted, and then just add our layout again real quick. So now we have created our first page. And if we go to the API view, you can actually see how this will be delivered through the REST API. So this data is what we are going to use later in our Next.js frontend to actually display all the data, put it into templates, and make a website out of that data. Okay, so let's move on and set up our Next.js frontend. For that, I'm going to create a new terminal by clicking on plus on the bottom right, and I'm going to do npx create next app at latest. Now this will help me initialize my Next.js project as well. First, it's going to ask me for the project name. I'm going to name it Payload NextJS Tutorial Front End. Now, for the sake of simplicity, we are not going to use TypeScript here. We're going to use plain JavaScript. We are not going to use ESLint, but we're going to use Tailwind CSS. And we're going to use the source directory, which makes sense. And since we talked about using the pages router for this tutorial, we're also not choosing to use the new app router, but the old pages router. So I'm going to select no here. We're not going to customize the import alias. And now it's going to install all dependencies. With all dependencies installed, the first thing I'm going to do is go into our folder and install a library called Axios, which we're going to use for our requests to the backend. So we're going to do npm install Axios. Now I'm going to add a global configuration for Axios in the _app.js to make it easier to work with it. I'm going to explain what I mean in a second. So on top of app.js, at the top of app.js, I'm going to paste in this type of code. So I'm importing Axios. And what I'm configuring here are global baselines for the entire project. So as you can see, I've added the Next.js, so next public backend URL environment variable as a base URL to Axios. So that way, if we do a request to the backend, we don't always have to include this URL, but we can just set it in our environment variables once, and it will use it across the entire project. To set up this environment variable, I'm going to go to the root folder. Okay, so not the source folder, but the root folder. Create a new file called .env.local. Okay, and in that one, I'm going to create the next public backend URL. You can basically name it however you want, but it's important that it starts with next public. Otherwise, your Next.js frontend won't have access to this environment variable. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to set it to HTTP localhost 4000. We can now already go ahead and do npm run dev, and that will start our new Next.js project on localhost 3000. So if we go back to our browser, go to localhost 3000, you should be able to see the boilerplate Next.js page. Now, the first thing that we're going to do here is create our blocks that we just created in the backend, so our hero block and our 2-column block in the front end. If you watch the first episode of this series, you can remember that in the backend, we basically define the data that a block should contain. And in the front end, we build a sort of a template file that then uses the data from the backend. So you basically create a template file with placeholders. And later on, those placeholders are replaced with the actual data from the CMS, and a static page is generated. So the first thing that we're going to do in the source folder, we're going to create a new folder called blocks. And here we're going to create the hero block. Now, I'm going to use the JSX file extension. You can also use JS or TS or TSX. As long as you have an X at the end, VS Code will actually automatically switch to IntelliSense for JSX. Okay, so that's just a practical hack. To create our block, I'm going to do RFC, which is a shortcut with the React Functional Components plugin for VS Code, which will just allow me to create a boilerplate React component pretty fast. Now, in order to make this the hero block, we actually have to check what data we have in the backend. So we have heading, we have text, and we have background image. And those three attributes are going to be passed down to this component. So we just have to do heading, text, and background image, if I'm correct. Heading, text, background image. So those will later be passed down in this component, and here we can use them. So to make things very simple, I'm just going to have an H2, and this is going to contain heading, and below that I'm going to have a P, which contains our text. For now, we can just leave out the background image. So this is how you build those templates. And same thing for the 2 columns block. In this block, we actually have one attribute more. We have heading, we have text, we have image and direction. So I'm going to destructure them here as well. Heading, text, image, and direction. Okay. And for now, I'm also just going to put the heading here, the text here, and we're leaving out the image and the direction for now. Moving on to the next step. So in order to connect the backend blocks with the front-end blocks, we actually have to create a file. You can call it whatever we want. We will call it blocklist.js. And this file will export a variable called blocks, which will be an object. And here it's very important. Here you are going to map the slugs, so hero and 2 column, the slugs of the backend blocks to the actual front-end blocks. So I'm going to say hero, and then we're going to import our hero block that we just created. And the same thing with 2 column. 2 column. So this, like I said, will actually map the backend slug that will be retrieved from the backend to a front end component, so that NextJS actually knows which data it should transform into which template in which block. Before we can move on, we actually have to create a helper function that will later go through the layout of each page, and for every block in this layout, render a block in the front end. So in the source folder, I'm going to create a utils folder, and in that I'm going to create the render blocks JSX file. I'm just going to paste the code in here, but it's pretty straightforward. So what you actually do is you have a component which gets a layout as a prop, the layout of each page. And what it does is it maps through the layout, and the layout is an array of blocks. And for every block, it actually looks up in the block list file. So if you can remember, we just created this block list file that we're importing here. So for every block, which will contain block type, which it's a bit complicated, but block type basically is the slug that you define in the backend. So it basically checks the block list file for the slug, and then it retrieves the actual block that is defined with the slug. So it will check, okay, blocks.hero is the imported hero block in the front end, okay? And then it will just render that block with all the data that you have provided it with. As soon as we have that set up, we can actually move on to the secret sauce, the one file that will make everything work together. And this is called double square brackets ... slug.js. So we're going to go into our pages folder and create this file. So slug.js. It's very important that you actually use 3 separate dots here, okay, and not this one 3-dot character. This actually cost more than 4 hours of trying things out and debugging for us, so just take care. Now, this is actually a dynamic route in NextJS, which means it's not like an index route or a test route where you have to define a fixed name for it, but it's actually dynamic. For that dynamic routing to work, we need 2 functions in addition to the component: getStaticPaths and getStaticProps, but we're going to get to that in a second. The first thing that I'm going to do is create the actual component. So I'm going to hit RSC again, and I obviously have to replace the name because it's not a valid component name, so we're just going to call it page in this case. The page receives a property called page, which is basically the page data from the backend. And what it should return is the render blocks component with the property layout set to page.layout. Okay, so this will basically make sure that for every page that is rendered, it shows the render blocks component, which will then, for every block in the page's layout, render a block on a page. Now we are going to add the 2 functions that make this dynamic route work. The first step is getStaticPaths. So the way this works is you just have to export this specific function in the same file. And when you run the build in the NextJS project, this function will actually run. And what it does is it uses Axios, which we have to import here as well real quick. Import Axios from Axios. It will actually do a request to the backend. As you can see, we don't have any URL here specified because we set the base URL in our global config. So it will check the REST API, Payload's REST API, in the collection pages. I've just set the limit to 100. You can set it to whatever you want. And it will basically map through all of those pages that are returned. And for every page, it will return the slug. Okay, the slug is the important part. The thing that you can see here is we've added a small detail. So as you can remember, if we go to the backend and we want to create a page, we have to define a slug. But if we want to set a home page, it doesn't have any slug. It's just a home page. So you could either leave it empty. We decided to have it the following way. So if you name a page, if you give it the slug index, okay, this will be the actual index page, the home page. So what this function does is it basically just replaces the index with just a normal slash to have this as the index homepage, okay? Now, this is only the first step. In the second step, you actually have to refetch that specific page again and compile the data. So it might be a bit hard to understand, but in this function, you can basically only generate a list of slugs for every page that should be generated. And then for every page, you'll have to execute another function, the getStaticProps function, to actually fetch all the specific page data and then render a page. So the getStaticProps function receives a context, which basically contains the slug that you just created. So for every item in this array that we return, this function will get called once, okay? We can actually remove that. That is not relevant here. So for this slug, it's going to request the backend again, but it will specifically request this page with this slug. Okay, and it will extract all the page data, and then it will create the page prop with the page data, which you can see here. Okay, so this is the data that is later received in the component. If you have any questions about this topic or you're a bit confused, feel free to ask anything in the comments. It might be a bit hard to wrap your head around, but in the end, it's really not that complicated. Last but not least, to make this work, we have to delete the default index page, because otherwise they will overwrite themselves. Now we can go ahead and test it out. So I'm just going to restart our front end real quick. And also you have to make sure that the backend is running, obviously, otherwise it won't be able to fetch the page data. So if we now go back to our browser, as you can see, we still have that created page with the slug test. So if I go into our front end right now, /test, it should display our data from the backend. Yeah, as you can see, it's not pretty, but it works. So this is basically our current hero block, and this is our 2-column block. To show you that it is dynamic, I'm just going to change this slug to index and save the page. So now if we refresh here, we should get an error. And if we go back to our index page and request that, now our page has moved here. To end things off, I'm going to show you how you can actually display images in the front end that you get from your backend. In order to make this work, we will go back to our hero block. And as you can see, we have the background image prop, which we are currently not using. If we console log it and check it out in our browser, we can see how it's delivered. So it's basically the same as in the backend here under API. Okay, it has the alt text, it has a URL, it has the file type, meme type, height and width. Okay, so in order to display it, I'm just going to add an next image tag. You can use the default img tag. However, it's strongly recommended that you actually use the next image tag, because that will automatically optimize your images and create a source set with different dimensions to make sure that you always deliver the perfect sized image to your client. Okay, so the image tag, it's the image tag has a source attribute, which we're going to set to the URL of the background image. So we're going to say background image.url. Now height will be background image.height, and width will be background image.width, and the alt text will be background image.alt. So if we refresh, it actually shows us an error, and I'm not sure why. Let me check. So as you can see, we're getting an error. The requested resource isn't a valid image. And as you can see, this is a relative URL. A relative URL will not work. And the issue is that Payload sets a relative URL here, so it delivers it. There are two options now. We can either, in front of that URL, we can put our backend URL. So we would say process.env next public backend URL / or not slash, because that slash is included here. What we could do as well is go into our payload config and use the server URL attribute, okay, and set this in our case to HTTP localhost 4000, okay. So if we restart our backend server now, we can see that if we refresh our page and check the API again, that now this is an absolute URL. Okay, so if we just restart our front end real quick and access the page again, it should now load the image. However, it still doesn't. There's another error, which is invalid source prop, because our host name localhost is not configured as a secure source for images. So in NextJS, you actually have to go ahead and define every source that you want to display image from to be secure. So let's go into our NextJS config, which is located here. And what we'll have to add is an attribute called images. And images remote patterns. Okay, this is an array of objects. And in every object, you need to add, first of all, a protocol, which will be HTTP in our case, because we are just fetching it locally. Then we need a host name, which will be localhost. And we need a port, which will be port 4000. Okay, so if we refresh it, this error should actually go away and we should be able to see the image. Yeah. Now, obviously, this example doesn't look pretty good. However, I think it's clear how you can actually go ahead and style your blocks. So whatever library you're using for styling, if you're using Tailwind CSS or something else, you can now go ahead and just build out this page to look beautiful, but it will still use those placeholders. Now, if you like this video, make sure to stay tuned for the next episode, where we're going to take care of global components and global data like the header or footer. And if you have any questions or need any help, feel free to let us know in the comments. And apart from that, take care.